Hi guys, I'm just another guy named James, and today I'm going to be talking about the X-Men graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills, which was released in 1982 as part of the Marvel graphic novel line, and it's actually the fifth Marvel graphic novel that was released. And it's written by longtime X-Men writer Chris Claremont and drawn by Brent Anderson. And honestly, the art in this story is really good. And I'll let you know right at the top, this story it's a bit on the dark side for a 1980s graphic novel. And let's see, there are a few things that are worth noting throughout this for the story to make sense. Let's see. At the time that this story came out, Magneto was a hard, fast villain. His goal was to conquer the world and remake it so that mutants could just rule the world, basically. Let's see. The X-Men team membership is not that advanced right now. There's only 6 of them. Let's see. What else? What else do you need to know? Nothing that I can really think of, but I don't know. But it's a typical X-Men story. It's pretty good. You know, teamwork and all that play a big part in the story. And honestly, I think it's a really good story. It has a lot of really cool artwork in it by Brent Anderson. I don't think I would like it if Brent Anderson had a run on an X-Men comic, but for this graphic novel, the art is really, really well suited for it. So yeah, I think we should just hop into our story, which begins with 2 children being hunted down and killed by a group of mutant hunters called Purifiers, and then being hung from a swing set for police to find. But the police don't find the bodies, Magneto does. And when he sees them, he brings them down, and he says, "An execution, not the first, and far from the last. Only this time, the victims are children, so young and so innocent. To know such terror, such pain, their only crime that they had been born, and for all my vaunted power, I was unable to save them. No more shall die, but those responsible for this atrocity, whatever the cost, however long it takes, I will hunt them down, and I will make them pay." We then cut to the actual villain of our story, who is Reverend William Stryker, who is reading a passage of the Bible before he's called by his assistant to view some tape on the X-Men. And we see that the team for this story consists of Kitty Pryde, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Storm, Cyclops, and Colossus. But after Stryker sees the tape, he is rushed into a TV studio. Next, we see Kitty Pryde get into a quick little fist fight at her dance studio with a kid who hates mutants. And she's losing the fight until Colossus steps in to defend her and scares off the kid that she's fighting. Kitty then runs home and Colossus and his sister Ileana go after her, after briefly apologizing to Kitty's dance instructor. In the mansion, we see that all of the X-Men have gathered to watch Professor X's debate against Stryker. And as the debate goes, we see that Xavier has better points with better logic, but Stryker knows TV and he knows how to work it, how to come off as friendly. So after the debate, the X-Men go to the Danger Room to do some training. The X-Men who are at the mansion, Cyclops and Storm, are at the TV studio with Professor X. But we then cut back to the studio where we see that Stryker has planned an attack on Professor X, Storm, and Cyclops. In the Danger Room, we see the X-Men training and testing the limits of their powers. And after the training session ends, we cut back to Professor X, who is ambushed as his car is blown up. But Cyclops blasts his way out, but he's shot, and Storm tries to fly away with Professor X, but she's caught up in a final explosion after a soldier fires on her car with a rocket launcher. Back at the school, we see that the X-Men are celebrating their successful training mission until they receive a call from the police who tell them that Professor X, Storm, and Cyclops are all dead. The next morning, we see Kitty and Illyana comfort each other over the deaths of their friends, and as the two girls talk, Illyana remembers why she came looking for Kitty in the first place. And it's because she found some sort of camouflaged sensor module. So Kitty deactivates it and decides to wait to see who comes in to fix it. Wolverine, Colossus, and Nightcrawler have gone to town to investigate the crash, and Wolverine determines that Professor X and the rest of the crew are still alive. Nightcrawler then reports that he sees two men investigating the X-Men's car, and then waiting by the car. So Wolverine makes the call to capture the people who are investigating them. So the X-Men attack the people who are spying on them, who turn out to be purifiers, while they're still in their car. Wolverine gets one of them out of the car, but the other drives away with Nightcrawler on top of the car. But Colossus is able to stop it, and Nightcrawler jumps into the car to pull out the last purifier, just before Colossus crushes the car. Colossus is then attacked from flaming remains of the car by two more purifiers in heavy battle armor. But basically before the fight even begins, Magneto intervenes and he strips the purifiers of their armor and then proposes a temporary alliance with the X-Men. Back at the mansion, another purifier group has come to repair the scanner. So Kitty leaves Illyana for a second to do some scouting, but almost as soon as Kitty leaves, Illyana is spotted and shot by the purifier leader with a stun gun. And at the sound of the gunshot, Kitty comes back and sees the purifiers loading Illyana into their car. So Kitty tries to get her out, but once she phases into the trunk, she's gassed by the purifiers. Inside the mansion, we see Wolverine interrogating the purifiers, trying to figure out what happened to their friends. But when Wolverine fails, Magneto steps in, and he breaks the purifiers, who tell him that they work for Stryker, who is going to use Professor X to eradicate all of mutant kind. We then see that Professor X is being haunted and taunted by visions of the X-Men betraying him. And then, after the X-Men betray him, he sees Reverend Stryker comforting him and convincing him to try to kill the X-Men. In real life, we see that Stryker hasn't been fully able to break Professor X yet, but he'll hurt Cyclops and Storm, but he refuses to kill them. And the whole goal of this is to try and break Professor X's massive resolve. During a break from the torture, Cyclops asks Stryker why he's doing all of this. And so Stryker begins to remember. He remembers there was no crusade then. I wasn't even a minister. Quite the opposite. Master Sergeant William Stryker, U.S. Army Rangers. Tough as nails, hell-raising professional soldier. On special assignment to military nuclear test program. The brass told us the danger was minimal, but we believed them. When my tour was over, my wife Mercy and I, we headed south to visit my family in Phoenix. But we never made it. Alone, out in the deserts of Nevada, I delivered my son. And it was a monster. Faced with that abomination, I did what had to be done. And when half conscious, Mercy asked for her baby, I took her in my arms. I held her close, and I broke her neck. The car had been leaking gas since the crash. It was a miracle there'd been no explosion. I planned to change that. I placed Mercy inside the wreck, her baby in her arms. Then I climbed in beside her, and I lit a match. Easy, fella. Don't try to move. The ambulance is on its way. You're a lucky man. That explosion must have blown you clear. You're gonna be alright. Mercy and the monster were burned beyond all recognition. None knew my shame. None but I. And try as I might, I could not forget. I was a war hero with a Class A record. So the army turned a blind eye to my drinking and fighting. I'd suffered a terrible loss. They were prepared to be patient, up to a point. I touched rock bottom without even the guts to kill myself. Then I saw a magazine article by Charles Xavier about mutants, and after months of torment, I knew what that monster was. It was a mutant. But could I have fathered such a wicked creature? Was my life so wicked that the Lord sought to punish me through my son? And if so, why then let me live? If I was evil, shouldn't I have been condemned to eternal damnation? I prayed for guidance, and it was given me. The evil, the sin, it was Marcy's and not mine. She was the vessel used by God to reveal unto me Satan's most insidious plot against humanity, to corrupt us through our children while they were still in the womb. The Lord created man and woman in His image, blessed with His grace. Mutants broke that sacred mold. They were creations not of God, but of the devil, and I had been chosen in the fight to lead the fight against them. From that lowly beginning came my ministry, and for a quarter century I labored in the wilderness, amassing phenomenal temporal power, and now at last the moment has come to put those resources to use. But he is brought out of his reminiscing by the purifiers who kidnapped Ileana and Kitty, who call and ask what they're supposed to do with the girls. Stryker tells them to kill Kitty, but he gives no specific instruction for Ileana. In the Bronx, we see the purifiers carry Ileana out of their car before they shoot it up, because they think Kitty is in the trunk, but she's gone. And we see Kitty run into a street gang before the purifiers catch up and they hold up the gang at gunpoint. And we get a quick little gang fight where the head of one of the gangs throws a knife at the lead purifier. But all that gives Kitty just enough time to phase through a wall and escape, but she's still being chased. So she tries to call the X-Men, but the phone she's using blows up, but she's able to phase through the explosion and keeps running, with the purifiers chasing after her and shooting at her. But eventually she makes it to the subway, and a cop tries to protect her, but he's shot, and the purifiers now have Kitty dead to rights, until Magneto shows up and he lifts the train, distracting the purifiers while the X-Men hop in and beat up the purifiers. Magneto is also able to pull the bullet out of the cop, saving his life. While they rush him to the hospital, we cut back to see Stryker running one final test on Professor X, one last round of conditioning. And at the end of this round of conditioning, we see Professor X kill Storm and Cyclops, showing that he is ready to be used by Stryker for his final plan. But before we get to see Stryker's plan in action, we see Stryker's chief scientist is kidnapped and interrogated by Kitty and Nightcrawler. Later, back in the Stryker building, we see that the leader of the Purifiers is escorting Ileana along with Cyclops and Storm's bodies down to a basement-level incinerator. But instead of going up in the elevator, they begin to go up, and they go up fast. Once the elevator breaks through the roof, the Purifier leader is able to jump out and reach safety, but Magneto and the X-Men now have Ileana and the bodies of their friends. But Wolverine knows something the rest of them don't, due to his heightened senses. And he knows that Storm and Cyclops are alive. That so Magneto does some CPR and some electromagnetic shocks on them to revitalize them. And when they wake up, they ask why Magneto's helping them. So he explains that while he does hope to conquer Earth and rule it for mutants, he knows that he's old. So when he dies, he wants the X-Men to take over for him. Next, we see that Stryker has built his own version of the supercomputer Cerebro, which is built to amplify Professor X's psychic abilities, and allows him to discover latent or active mutants. And thanks to Stryker's conditioning, Professor X is going to use that device to kill every mutant at the end of a televised sermon that Stryker is about to preach. But before Stryker goes on stage, the leader of the Purifiers warns Stryker that the X-Men are coming. But he doesn't care, so he goes on stage. As Stryker begins his sermon, we see that there's some very mixed reactions to his message, with some viewing it as dangerous and others cheering him on. As Stryker begins condemning mutants to hell, the machine is turned on, and all the mutants around him begin dying through the psionic attack of Professor X. As soon as the X-Men are locked in indecision with how to deal with Stryker, Magneto comes in and is immediately attacked by the full psionic blast of Professor X. So he's down for a little bit. Back at the base of the building, the X-Men are fighting through an army of purifiers as they try to free Professor X. We then see that the lead purifier is bleeding out, meaning she is a mutant. So Stryker pushes her off of his pulpit, killing her by breaking her neck, which is seen on national television. We then see the X-Men pull a trick play on Professor X, where Nightcrawler and Wolverine teleport in to attack him, while Cyclops hits him with a ricochet blast. Cyclops then destroys the machine, and he leads the X-Men out onto a pulpit, and he engages in a debate about mutants, saying, "Good evening, Reverend. X-Men, Storm, and Cyclops, but you're supposed to be dead? Yeah, we're just full of surprises, Stryker, as you'll soon see. You've been making some pretty extreme charges against us, and we figure we'd claim equal time to answer them. You don't mind, do you? Your toys are broken, Reverend. Your goons are beaten. It's just our word against yours. Then I have nothing to fear. You're a lucky man. Thanks to you and people like you, mutants live in fear every day of our lives. And sometimes those lives are very, very short. Less than 2 weeks ago, 2 children in Connecticut were murdered, Stryker, condemned solely for an accident of birth. Would you do that to someone because of the color of their skin? Or their beliefs? I do nothing, Cyclops. I am an instrument of the Lord. And whatever a man's color or beliefs, he is still human. Those children, and you X-Men, are not. Says who? You? What makes your link with heaven any stronger than mine? We have unique gifts, but no more so and no more special than those granted a physician or a physicist or a philosopher or an athlete. It could be due to an accident of birth, or nature, or divine providence. Who's to say? Are arbitrary labels more important than the way we live our lives? What we're supposed to be more important than we actually are? For all you know, we could be the real human race, and the rest of you the mutants. Human? You dare call that thing human? He's more human than you. Nightcrawler's generous, and kind, and decent. He had every reason to be bitter, every excuse to become as much of a demon on the inside as he is out. But he decided he'd rather learn to laugh instead. I hope I can be half the person he is. And if I have to choose between caring for my friend and believing in your God, then I choose my friend. Let those blasphemous words, girl, be your epithet. And as soon as it started, it ends with Stryker pointing a gun at Kitty Pryde, but as soon as he does that, he's shot by a cop. And then to end the story, we see Magneto offer an alliance to the X-Men because they can't beat the ideals of Stryker, so why even bother trying? And Professor X actually agrees with Magneto until Cyclops talks him out of it, saying that the X-Men will not join Magneto. Magneto then makes the offer again, specifically to Professor X. But he refuses, saying that if the X-Men are willing to die and to fight and die for his dream, then he must fight with them. So Magneto leaves, saying that he does truly hope that the X-Men succeed, but if they fail, it'll be time to do things his way. Alright, so that's the story. And honestly, it's a great story. It's really well written. I like that it has this kind of 80s X-Men comic trope of having Kitty Pryde be the main character instead of frankly one of the characters with more interesting powers like Wolverine or Cyclops. But I like that Cyclops is still very deeply heroic throughout this story. I think I think this just nails all of the X-Men characters to a T. I really like I like the team of X-Men in this story a lot. I like that it's Kitty Pryde, Colossus, Nightcrawler. I always really like Nightcrawler. He's one of my favorite X-Men. Yeah, this is just a good story. One of my favorite things is that it's really the first time that we see Magneto as anything but a villain. And it really does suit to forward the character arc that he would go through over the next 15 years, I think, in the X-Men comics, where he would eventually become the leader of the X-Men until a bunch of other real world events affected how the X-Men comic was going to progress, but I digress. This is the first time you see Magneto ally himself with the X-Men. It's the first time you see him basically be a good guy, and he really is the good guy of this story. He doesn't kill any of the people that he is fighting against the entire story. He doesn't retaliate with violence against any of them. It's just a pretty clean story for Magneto, especially considering how at the start it really did seem like he was going to go on a rampage against the Purifiers at some point. But I like that he's able to hold that in check for the story. And honestly, maybe my favorite part of this story is that Professor X is barely in it, because Professor X is honestly one of the most boring and dull X-Men characters. And yeah, I really like the art is just incredible throughout this story. It suits the story so well. It suits the sort of darker, muddier tone that the story has. And I'm not saying the art's muddy, but there's a lot of hatching, a lot of cross hatching, which for a graphic novel of this time is not the most common thing in the world. And that graphic novel coloring style really helps the grunginess of the story come through. Yeah, I really like the art, especially for the story. But yeah, I just think it's a great story. I think that middle of the story action scene of Kitty running from the Purifiers, I think that's probably the best scene in this graphic novel. It's a great scene. And yeah, honestly, that's probably a standout. That's a standout scene for sure. But yeah, I really like it. I like that this story isn't, your typical modern X-Men story about how if they work together as a team, they can do whatever needs to get done. Coming out, reading this on the heels of watching X-Men 97 and the 90s cartoon, and frankly a lot of the other X-Men media, it's really refreshing that it's a story that isn't all about the value of teamwork. But yeah, I dig this story a lot. It's really cool. I think William Stryker as the villain is super interesting because he's a villain unlike any other X-Men villain, really. Because he's a villain purely of rhetoric. He's a threat not because of what he does, but because of what he says, because of what he inspires others to do. And especially at the time for X-Men, that was very refreshing, because most of the villains that you saw at the time were very direct physical threats to the X-Men, and there was just the general, basically racism against the mutants. But having putting a specific name and face to that was really interesting. And honestly, having it be a reverend, having Stryker be a reverend was a really interesting choice, because I just thought it was an interesting choice, especially seeing his full origin and seeing just how completely he misses the point of who God is. And I just think that's a really interesting dynamic for the story. It's not really that explored in the story, but it's a cool little subtler detail. But yeah, honestly, I think it's a great story. I think it's definitely one of my favorite X-Men comics that I read. I haven't read that many, but it's definitely a standout favorite. But yeah, if you can find it, I would highly recommend buying the actual like full-size graphic novel like this. It's a little hard to find, and it ranges in price a lot. I don't know why. I bought this for maybe $5, but I've seen them go for as much as 80. I don't understand what's going on with all that, but you know, it is what it is. And there are modern reprintings of this that have like a hardcover and all that, and those are going to be easier for you to find. I think you can find them at your local used bookstore most of the time. But yeah, honestly, that's really all I've got time for today. But God Loves, Man Kills. It's a great story, great artwork, very, very well written, which is not surprising to anybody who knows Chris Claremont's work. So yeah, very highly recommend this story. But that's really all I've got time for today. So I'm just another guy named James, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.